It was an evening that would change everything. Adora, a 48-year-old mother, had always tried to keep her daughter Amaka safe. But on this particular night, everything went wrong. Amaka's boyfriend, Chaik, had been causing problems for a long time. He was 27, and his relationship with Amaka had become tense, full of arguments that seemed to get worse every time. Adora wanted him out of her daughter's life, but Chaik refused to leave. He stayed in the house, pushing everyone's patience to the limit. That night, Chaik and Amaka had another heated argument. Adora could hear their raised voices from the next room. She had warned Chaik before that his presence was no longer welcome in their home, but he wouldn't listen. As the argument grew louder, Adora decided she had had enough. She confronted Chaik, telling him to leave for good, but things escalated quickly, and in a sudden moment of anger, Adora made a choice that would end in tragedy. Chaik refused to leave again, and in a heated confrontation, Adora grabbed a weapon and struck him. What was meant to stop him from staying turned fatal. Chaik collapsed, and in the blink of an eye, Adora's life and her daughter's world were forever changed. This is the story of a mother's desperate actions, a daughter's heartbreaking loss, and a crime that tore a family apart. As the investigation unfolds, the truth behind that tragic night will come to light, revealing the deep emotions that led to Chaik's death. Stay with us as we uncover the full story of what really happened. It all began with a relationship that, from the outside, seemed harmless enough. Amaka, a young woman of 24, had fallen for Chaik, a man 3 years older than her. He was confident and charming, but over time the cracks in their relationship began to show. Amaka's mother, Adora, had never been fond of Chaik from the start. She had her suspicions about him, often feeling that he was hiding something, and as time went on, her concerns only grew. Chaik had a habit of lingering in the family home longer than Adora liked. He would stay late into the night, and as his arguments with Amaka became more frequent, Adora's patience wore thin. The tension between mother and daughter grew as well. Adora wanted what was best for her daughter, but she saw Chaik as a negative influence. He was controlling, often refusing to leave the house even when things got heated. Adora watched as Amaka's once bright personality started to fade under the weight of the toxic relationship. The problems between Amaka and Chaik became worse. They would argue constantly, with Chaik refusing to leave even when things were tense. Adora tried to talk to her daughter, but Amaka was torn between her loyalty to Chaik and her mother's warnings. The situation at home became unbearable, with Adora feeling like her own space was being invaded. Despite her attempts to keep peace, it was clear that something needed to change. One night, Chaik came over to visit Amaka again. The argument began almost as soon as he walked in the door. Adora in the next room could hear every word. Chaik was demanding, raising his voice, and refusing to listen to anything Amaka said. He insisted on staying, even though Amaka had asked him to leave. Adora's patience had finally run out. She had dealt with this long enough, and she was tired of Chaik disrespecting her daughter and her home. Adora entered the room, firm in her stance. She told Chaik that he needed to leave the house immediately. She had never liked confrontations, but she knew it was time to take a stand. Chaik, however, wasn't about to back down. He scoffed at her, acting as though he owned the place. Amaka tried to intervene, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The tension in the room was palpable. As the argument continued, Chaik's refusal to leave became a breaking point for Adora. She had had enough of seeing her daughter in pain and feeling disrespected in her own home. In a moment of anger, Adora grabbed a nearby object, a heavy, blunt object that was within arm's reach. The room fell silent for a second, but then everything happened so quickly. Chaik turned, and in a fit of rage and frustration, Adora struck him. The force of the blow caught everyone by surprise, including herself. Chaik staggered backward, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Amaka screamed as Chaik collapsed to the ground, the reality of the situation crashing down on all of them. Adora, standing in shock, could hardly believe what she had done. She had never intended for things to go this far. It was supposed to be an argument, not something that would end in tragedy. Chaik lay on the floor, unmoving, and it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Amaka rushed to his side, but it was too late. The impact of the blow had been too much. Chaik's body was lifeless, and in that instant, everything changed for Adora and her daughter. The panic set in quickly. Adora, still in shock, dropped the object and backed away from the scene. She had acted out of a desperate need to protect her daughter and herself, but now there was no undoing what had happened. Amaka was in tears, unable to process the loss of the man she had loved, despite the conflict between them. The home that had once been a place of relative peace was now a crime scene. Adora knew that there was no hiding what had happened, and soon the consequences of that one moment would come crashing down on her. This was not just a mistake, it was the end of everything they had known. As the weight of what had just occurred settled in, Adora's mind raced. There was no turning back from this. The life that had been built over the years was now shattered, and all because of one tragic decision. As Chaik lay motionless on the floor, the weight of what Adora had just done settled over her like a heavy fog. Her heart pounded as the reality of the situation sank in. She had acted without thinking, fueled by months of frustration and fear for her daughter. But now, Chaik was dead, and there was no undoing what had happened. Amaka knelt beside Chaik, shaking him, pleading for him to wake up. But it was too late. The blow had been fatal. Adora stood frozen, watching as her daughter wept over Chaik's body. The room felt smaller, closing in on her as her thoughts raced. She had wanted to protect her daughter from a man she believed was dangerous, but now she had taken his life. There was no going back from this, and the consequences of her actions were starting to unfold in her mind. What would happen next? What would she tell the police? And how could she explain this to Amaka? The house, once filled with tense arguments, was now eerily quiet. Amaka's sobs echoed through the space, and Adora knew that she needed to act quickly. They couldn't leave Chaik's body there, but more importantly, they needed to call the authorities. Adora's instincts told her to protect her daughter from further harm, but she also knew that there was no escaping what had just occurred. The truth would come out, and they needed to face it head-on. With trembling hands, Adora picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number. She hesitated for a moment, her mind replaying the events that had led to this tragedy. She had wanted to keep Amaka safe, but her actions had only made things worse. As the call connected, Adora could barely find the words to explain what had happened. The operator asked for details, and Adora, trying to stay calm, told them about the argument, the confrontation, and how Chaik was no longer breathing. The police and an ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens blaring down the quiet street. Adora and Amaka stood in the living room, their faces pale and their hearts heavy with fear. The first responders entered the house, quickly assessing the situation. It didn't take long for them to confirm that Chaik was dead. The paramedics tried to revive him, but it was clear that there was nothing more they could do. Chaik was pronounced dead at the scene. As the police officers began their investigation, Adora was questioned about the events leading up to Chaik's death. She recounted everything, from the argument between Chaik and Amaka to her own desperate attempt to make him leave. She explained how she had grabbed the object in a moment of panic, never intending to kill him. The officers listened closely, taking notes and asking questions, but Adora could see the seriousness of the situation in their faces. This was no longer just an argument that had gotten out of hand, it was now a homicide investigation. Amaka, still in shock, could barely speak. She answered the police's questions as best as she could, but her mind was clouded by grief. She had loved Chaik, despite the tension between them, and now he was gone. She couldn't believe that her mother had been the one to end his life. The weight of that realization made it hard for her to breathe. Everything had changed in an instant, and Amaka didn't know how to process the loss of the man she had loved or the actions her mother had taken. Inspector Uche, a seasoned officer with years of experience in dealing with domestic disputes that turned violent, was assigned to the case. He arrived at the scene, taking in the gravity of the situation. He had seen similar cases before, where emotions spiraled out of control, and the result was a death that could have been avoided. But this case was different. It involved a mother trying to protect her daughter, and the lines between right and wrong seemed blurred by the tragic outcome. Inspector Uche began piecing together the details, speaking with Adora and Amaka separately. He listened to their accounts of what had happened, but he knew that the investigation would need to be thorough. There were questions that still needed answers. Why had Chaik refused to leave? Was there more to their relationship than what was being said? And most importantly, was this truly an act of self-defense, or had something more sinister been at play? As the investigation continued, the home that had once been a place of safety for Amaka and Adora became the center of a police inquiry. The forensics team combed through the house, gathering evidence, while Inspector Uche reviewed the details of the case. The officers took statements from neighbors who had heard the argument but had no idea it would end in tragedy. Everyone involved was left in shock at how quickly the situation had escalated. Adora was taken into custody for further questioning, her mind reeling with guilt and fear. She knew that what she had done would have lasting consequences, not only for her but for Amaka as well. The future that she had hoped to protect for her daughter was now shattered, and the weight of that realization crushed her. Amaka, left alone in the house after her mother was taken away, sat in silence. The events of the night replayed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. The man she had loved was gone, her mother was in police custody, and their lives had been forever changed by one tragic decision. As the investigation deepened, Inspector Uche began to piece together the story behind the fatal night. The police had spoken to both Adora and Amaka, and it was clear that the situation had escalated quickly. What started as a heated argument had ended in tragedy, but now it was up to the authorities to determine whether Adora's actions were justifiable or if something more intentional had occurred. Adora remained in police custody, shaken by what had transpired. She had given her statement to the police, explaining that she had acted out of desperation. In her mind, she had been trying to protect her daughter from a man who had refused to leave, but the weight of her actions was starting to settle in. This wasn't just about protecting her home anymore. It was about facing the consequences of a life lost. Chaik's death had been sudden, and while Adora had not planned it, she couldn't escape the reality that she had taken his life. Inspector Uche, known for his calm and thorough approach to cases, looked closely at the details. The neighbors had reported hearing loud arguments from the house for weeks, though none of them had expected it to escalate to this level. Several neighbors told the police they had seen Chaik around frequently, and that his presence often stirred tension. This information supported Adora's claims that she had felt threatened by him, but it didn't erase the fact that her reaction had been fatal. Forensic teams had combed through the house, gathering evidence. They found the object Adora had used to strike Chaik, a heavy blunt object, now marked as evidence in what was becoming a complicated case. The autopsy revealed that the blow to Chaik's head had been severe enough to cause immediate death. While it was clear that Chaik had not been armed or physically aggressive toward Adora in the moments leading up to his death, Inspector Uche needed to determine whether Adora had acted out of genuine fear for her and Amaka's safety, or if her actions were more calculated than she claimed. Amaka, still reeling from the loss of her boyfriend and the arrest of her mother, was at the center of the investigation. The police questioned her at length about her relationship with Chaik. Had he ever been violent with her? Did she feel threatened by him? These were the questions that would shape how the case moved forward. Amaka was conflicted. She loved Chaik despite their fights, but she had also seen his stubbornness and refusal to leave the house when asked. She couldn't deny that she had felt trapped in that moment, torn between the man she loved and her mother, who had only wanted to protect her. Amaka's account of the events was key to understanding how things had unfolded. She told the investigators that while Chaik had never physically harmed her, his presence in the house that night had been overwhelming. He had refused to leave even after multiple arguments, and Amaka admitted that she had been afraid the situation would escalate further. Her mother had stepped in to try to defuse the situation, but instead, things had spiraled out of control. The case soon gained media attention, with reporters speculating about whether Adora had acted in self-defense or if her actions had crossed the line into something more intentional. The public was divided. Some believed Adora had every right to defend herself and her daughter, especially after months of growing tension with Chaik. Others saw it as an act of aggression that could have been avoided if emotions hadn't boiled over. As the investigation progressed, Adora's lawyer began building her defense. The argument was simple: Adora had acted in the heat of the moment, trying to protect her daughter and herself from a man who had refused to leave. It was a case of self-defense, the lawyer argued, even though Chaik had not been physically threatening. The lawyer emphasized that Adora had felt cornered in her own home, leading her to act in a way she never would have under normal circumstances. However, the prosecution began to build a case against Adora. They argued that while Chaik had refused to leave, there was no evidence to suggest that he had been physically violent or posed an immediate threat to Adora or Amaka. They painted a picture of a woman who had grown frustrated with her daughter's boyfriend and had snapped in a moment of rage. While they acknowledged that Adora hadn't planned the attack, they emphasized that her actions were reckless and had resulted in a man's death. The complexity of the case deepened with each new piece of evidence. Adora's family and friends described her as a kind, loving woman who had never been prone to violence. This was a stark contrast to the image the prosecution was trying to paint. Chaik's friends, meanwhile, spoke of him as someone who had struggled in his relationship with Amaka, but had never shown signs of violence. Both sides of the story were unfolding in a way that made the truth harder to pinpoint. As the days turned into weeks, the case slowly inched toward trial. Inspector Uche continued to gather details, knowing that this was a case that would require careful consideration from the jury. It wasn't a simple open and shut matter of self-defense. The emotions, relationships, and motivations at play were complex, and unraveling them would take time. The courtroom was packed as the trial for Adora began. The tension was palpable as both the defense and prosecution laid out their cases. Adora, sitting quietly at the defense table, looked worn and tired. The weight of her actions hung heavily over her, and the thought of facing the consequences for Chake's death made each passing moment more difficult. Amaka, sitting behind her mother in the courtroom, felt torn between grief for her lost boyfriend and her love for her mother. The prosecution's argument was clear from the start. They painted Adora as a woman who had allowed her emotions to get the best of her, resulting in the death of a young man who, though difficult at times, didn't deserve to lose his life. They focused on the fact that Chike hadn't been armed, and that, even though he had refused to leave, there had been no immediate threat to Adora or Amaka. The prosecution called neighbors to the stand, who recounted the frequent arguments they had heard but emphasized that none of them had ever seen Chike act violently toward Adora or her daughter. The prosecution's case was built around the idea that Adora had acted impulsively, letting her frustration turn into violence. They argued that Chike's refusal to leave was not enough to justify the fatal blow that had ended his life. The prosecutor presented the object Adora had used to strike Chike, showing the jury how much force had been applied to cause such a devastating injury. They insisted that Adora's actions went beyond self-defense, crossing into the realm of reckless behavior that resulted in death. The defense, however, argued a different story. Adora's lawyer focused on the months of tension leading up to that night. They described how Adora had felt increasingly threatened by Chike's constant presence, the strain it had put on her relationship with Amaka, and the fear that something worse could happen if she didn't act. The defense portrayed Adora as a mother who had simply reached her breaking point, acting in the heat of the moment to protect her daughter from a man who had repeatedly ignored their boundaries. Amaka's testimony was one of the most emotional moments of the trial. She recounted the night Chike died, explaining how their argument had escalated and how her mother had stepped in when Chike refused to leave. She told the court that while Chike had never physically harmed her, his refusal to respect their wishes had made the situation unbearable. Amaka was visibly shaken as she described the moment her mother struck Chike, still processing the fact that her mother's actions had taken the life of someone she had loved. As the trial continued, the jury listened intently to both sides. Inspector Uche, the lead investigator, testified about the evidence collected from the scene. He carefully walked the jury through the forensics, explaining how the position of Chike's body and the force of the blow pointed to an impulsive act, rather than premeditation. His testimony was crucial, as it provided a clear timeline of events and added weight to the prosecution's argument that Adora had acted out of frustration, not out of fear for her life. Adora herself took the stand, her voice shaky as she described what had led to the fatal night. She explained that she had never intended to kill Chike, but in that moment she had felt overwhelmed by a combination of fear, anger, and exhaustion. Adora emphasized that she had only wanted him to leave, to stop disrupting their lives. She described the buildup of tension over the months, how Chike had refused to respect her wishes, and how she had acted without thinking, not fully understanding the consequences of her actions until it was too late. Throughout her testimony, Adora remained calm, but the remorse in her voice was evident. She wasn't a violent person, she insisted, and the thought of taking someone's life had never crossed her mind before that night. Her lawyer worked to humanize her in front of the jury, portraying her as a mother who had made a tragic mistake while trying to protect her daughter and herself from a situation that had spiraled out of control. As the trial neared its end, both sides gave their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the fact that a life had been taken. Regardless of the emotions involved, they argued Adora's actions had crossed the line into criminal recklessness. Chike was gone, and his family deserved justice for his untimely death. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded with the jury to see Adora's actions through the lens of a mother's desperation. They emphasized that she had not acted with malicious intent but out of fear and frustration, and that she had not intended to kill Chike. With both sides resting their cases, the jury was left to deliberate. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the verdict that would decide Adora's future. The tension was unbearable for both Adora and Amaka, who sat together in silence, knowing that their lives would never be the same, no matter the outcome. The trial had brought to light the complexities of human emotions, and how a moment of desperation could lead to irreversible consequences. The jury now had the difficult task of deciding whether Adora's actions were justifiable in the heat of the moment, or whether she had acted recklessly and needed to be held accountable for taking a life. The jury returned to the courtroom after hours of tense deliberation. Adora sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to brace herself for what was about to happen. Amaka was by her side, tears silently streaming down her face. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as everyone waited for the verdict that would determine Adora's future. The case had been complex, and the emotions surrounding it made the outcome uncertain for everyone involved. The judge asked the jury if they had reached a decision, and after a few moments the verdict was read aloud. Adora was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury had accepted that she had not intended to kill Chaik but ruled that her actions were reckless enough to warrant legal consequences. While the defense had tried to show that Adora was simply acting to protect herself and her daughter, the prosecution's argument had convinced the jury that her response had gone too far. As the judge delivered Adora's sentence, the room remained still. She was given several years in prison, a punishment that was lighter than it could have been but still significant. The court recognized the emotional circumstances surrounding the case, but in the end, a life had been lost, and justice had to be served. Adora accepted the sentence with quiet resignation, knowing that her life and Amaka's would never be the same. After the trial, Amaka struggled to come to terms with the outcome. She had lost two important people in her life: Chaik, the man she had loved, and her mother, who was now going to prison. The weight of guilt pressed down on her, knowing that her relationship with Chaik had played a part in the tragedy that had unfolded. She couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different, if they had made different choices, if her mother hadn't been pushed to the edge that fateful night. Adora, too, would carry the burden of that night for the rest of her life. Though she was behind bars, her mind often returned to the events that had led to Chaik's death. She replayed the moment over and over again in her head, wondering if there had been any way to stop it before it spiraled out of control. But the consequences were irreversible, and she had to face the reality that she had taken a life, even if she hadn't meant to. The community was left in shock by the trial's outcome. People had watched closely, divided over whether Adora had been justified in her actions or if she had gone too far. Many felt sympathy for her, understanding the emotional strain she had been under, but others believed that the law had rightly punished her for taking someone's life. Regardless of opinion, the case had highlighted how easily things can escalate when emotions take over, leaving devastation in their wake. Inspector Uche, who had been instrumental in solving the case, reflected on the complexity of the situation. This wasn't a straightforward crime, it was layered with personal struggles, desperation, and tragic decisions. Though the legal case had come to an end, the emotional scars left behind were deep, and the families involved would be dealing with the aftermath for years to come. As Adora settled into her new reality in prison, she tried to focus on the time ahead. She knew that Amaka would be waiting for her once her sentence was complete, and the thought of reuniting with her daughter kept her going. Though she had made a terrible mistake, Adora hoped that one day they could move past the tragedy and find some semblance of peace. The case of Adora and Chaik was a tragic reminder of how quickly things can unravel when emotions run high. It showed that in moments of intense conflict, one decision could change the course of many lives forever. The story of a mother trying to protect her daughter, a young woman torn between love and family, and a man who lost his life too soon left a lasting impact on all who heard it.